E-quip Math PD series. We're excited to see everyone here in the final episode of our season. Today we'll be focusing on differentiating math instruction for complex classrooms. And we have a number of special guests here with us to explore this topic with you. Danielle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, my name is Danielle Legault, and I work for Minneapolis ABE, and I'm a teacher. I've taught ESL and math from low-level ELL students like level 2 all the way through GED.
I'm Abby Rosa, and I work for Hennepin County. I teach in an adult correctional facility.
And this is Astrid Leiden, currently filling in for Amy Vickers. Amy is in the process of trying to join us for the discussion, but I'll be helping to facilitate the conversation until she joins us. And with us today is also Marisa Giesler, who is helping out with technical support. So if you are having any issues with the training platform and need some assistance, you can chat directly to Marisa. You can do that by taking a look at your control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, and selecting her name from the drop-down box.
Hello everyone, this is Marisa. Hope that everything's going well and you can hear us all.
So we'll have a number of ways for you to participate in the webinar today. We are recording the webinar for those who aren't able to join us or for those who enjoy it so much that you'd like to go back and listen again. You can contact the presenters and the rest of the audience by using the chat feature. We encourage you to send any of your content questions to the entire audience, and the presenters will address those as possible. There'll also be the option later in the webinar to raise your hand and share your questions and thoughts orally. So right now we do have everyone muted to cut down on background noise, but later on you'll be able to raise your hand, and you can do that by finding the hand icon just to the left-hand side of your control panel. Click that by raising your hand. And then we can unmute you so you can hear. And again, if you have any technical issues, you can chat directly to Marisa and she can help you out. So as we go through the discussion, you can type your follow-up questions in the chat, or you can jot them down and we'll address them during the later part of the webinar. Feel free to share your own ideas and resources in the chat box to make this a really rich discussion that includes context from all around the state. And then later in the webinar we'll have some time for more in-depth Q&A, guided practice, and opportunity to share resources after the webinar. So objectives today are to describe differentiation in the adult education classroom, to list some examples of differentiation of content, process, and product in a math setting, and to allow you to access resources related to differentiation for your classroom. Danielle, do you want to talk through a little bit about what we mean by a complex classroom?
Yes, a complex classroom is something that we all can relate to, and here we're talking about students who are, of course, in different levels of their math and numeracy skills, as well as possibly different levels of English, and also students who have gaps in their knowledge and their math skills. For example, a student might be able to do algebra, but they forgot how to multiply decimals, for example. And as we all know, our students all have various and different learning styles and strengths, and the more we can access those, the better the students can do in our classrooms. Yes, and as the last part says, anyone who walks in the door. So many programs have intake every week or sometimes every day where students might come to a classroom at, that day and you weren't aware of their skills ahead of time. And so we'll try to present some examples of where you can do differentiation even if you're not aware ahead of time of a student's skills. So we'll talk about how adults can more effectively reach learners in these complex classrooms. And we all have a little bit of experience, but hopefully through this webinar you'll be able to find some additional resources, or at least some more ideas that you can apply to your classroom. So differentiation could be described as when we change either the content of what a student might be doing, which would be maybe different, they're doing different activities or using different materials, or it could be changing the process, which is how a student approaches the same material but does something different with it, or it could be changing or varying the product, which is the end product of what they produce during class or during their activity, even though they're learning essentially the same material but presenting in a different way at the end. And we'll give you some examples of each of these through the webinar.
And Danielle, if I could add, I think this is also a useful way for teachers to sort of self-assess the way they're approaching differentiation. It lets you sort of break these are certainly overlapping things, right, that varying content and process and product overlap with each other. When you vary one, the other is affected. But if you're thinking about how you differentiate your class, it may be helpful to think about, okay, well, how do I differentiate in content? What am I doing to differentiate process? And would it be valuable to me to differentiate product?
Yes, and I think our focus is not on exactly, our focus today is to give you ideas and then at the end to share some ideas that you may have as well, and not necessarily to say, is this differentiating content or is it differentiating process or product, because sometimes an activity could be one or the other. So although we'll present you some examples of all of them, the focus is on how can you differentiate in your classroom. And one way, just as a food for thought from the beginning, is one way I've found that when I do differentiate in my classroom, that the students stay motivated because they're interested in what they're doing. They are learning material that's applicable to their needs right now, and they can proceed at their own pace. And that's one advantage I found when I do differentiation.
So Danielle, can you tell us a little bit more about your learners and your context?
Yes. I've taught ESL classes where I've introduced some numeracy, and I've taught, we also have classes with standalone math classes, which we realize a lot of programs don't have, but standalone math classes for ELL students with skills learning, with students learning skills like place value or basic addition or groupings. And we also have classes all the way through GED level. And the classroom setting is I have classes with as few as 7 students perhaps, but as many as 30 in a class.
Okay,
and Abby, what about your setting?
All right, so I think of my setting as individualized instruction. Some people call it kind of one-room schoolhouse. Students that come in groups, typically I'd say maybe between 7 and 11, but it could be as low as 3 on a given day or as high as 15 or 16 on a given day. Even within my classroom, there's another teacher who has a different group of students literally using the same physical space at the same time. Usually every student is working on a different set of objectives, although sometimes those objectives overlap and I can pull them together in small groups or occasionally even into a whole group. It's a correctional setting, so students don't start at the same time. They come and go based on their sentence, and because of schedule, they may be coming and going at different times of day. each student meets with me, and we together make an individual plan. And then I sort of plan my instruction to be either individual, where I give a lesson to one student, or I combine them in small groups and whole groups when that need overlaps. When I set up with my students, when I do an introduction to what the class will be like, I'll sometimes describe it as a mix between a traditional classroom, kind of a whole group classroom, and a study hall. During the guided or independent practice, they're often on all different things. And Rob Podlasek from the MLC describes it as butterfly teaching, where the students are spread around the room and the teacher moves between them, sort of pollinating with little, with short lessons to different groups of students. So my plans are super differentiated. It's differentiated for every student, and I develop and I sort of develop those over time collaboratively with the students that I'm working with.
Okay, great. So given those really diverse contexts and student needs, how do you determine what each student needs in your different contexts?
In my classroom, I will do some, if we have formal assessments like a CASAS or a TABE, or if we have a placement test that we use in orientation, I can use those. If not, I can use if the students have taken a classroom test that I created, I could use that. Or often, as might be applicable to many teachers, is I can do a warm-up activity that very day, and that can help me determine if the students know the material or not. And I'll be sharing some examples later, although I can give you actually one example right now. Recently I've been teaching geometry, so I have a couple examples I'll be sharing today about geometry. And for example, I may start the class by drawing some rectangles on the board and writing a number for the width and the length, like 2 feet and 5 feet or something like that. And without much instruction, I might ask the students to write down and figure out the perimeter of those rectangles as well as the area. So this would be like a pre-activity, a warm-up or pre-activity for the main activity we'll be doing for the day. And as they're working on that, I can circulate around the classroom and see who knows already what to do and who does not. So it's a short way to find out exactly what the students are capable of doing.
I'm doing, again, as Danielle said, a mix of formal and informal assessment. I have a diagnostic from a book called Basic Essentials of Math it's very old school. It's just a list of computational problems, really, but it gives me a sense of what they can and can't do, or what they're familiar with, or what they've gotten rusty on right off the bat. I'm also doing informal observation of students' work. I'm making some teacher-made diagnostics, and I'm also asking my students for input. So throughout, especially at the beginning, I'm asking if they know of areas that they want to work on or they don't feel strong in. We had one student recently who started, and she actually has quite a bit of math skills, but she said, I don't know, I never understood multiplication, and that's always been confusing me the whole way along. So we knew we wanted to go back and sort of strengthen that foundation and move forward from there. The other thing that I'd say is during the observation, I'm looking not only at whether their answer is right, but how they're getting there, which I know probably for some of you it doesn't sound that revolutionary, but I may have two students who did a multiplication problem correctly, and one of them really is solving with a computational algorithm, and another one drew like 7 rows of 9 sticks each to get to 63, which is kind of letting me know a lot about what they understood about the background of the problem or the deeper concept. I'll also ask students when they get a problem right to tell me why they did the steps they did, or if it's computational math, I'll ask them to make up a story about the problem they just solved. Like if they divided 37 by 2, I'll say, okay, you got the right answer. If this was a pile of jelly beans, which of these numbers would be the pile of jelly beans? To get a sense of if they know, if they're visualizing what's happening or what they're understanding about the lower levels of knowing. All right. We both mentioned the formal and informal assessment, so it might be a good time to make sure we're all on the same page with what that means. I want to actually just pause really quick. I want to really encourage folks to use the chat box. In fact, if you can hear me now, would you mind going over to the chat and just put a note in there, hi, or I can hear you, so I can see that you're comfortable at least putting something. Yes, hello, thank you. So I want to encourage you, something that I really like about participating in webinars is I always have a lot of questions, and in real life, physical, like person-to-person presentations, it is distracting and kind of, I think, sometimes rude to be asking the people around me questions while the presenter is presenting. But the chat box is amazing for that. So don't be shy. If you have an idea of a resource that's related to this, or you have for example, right now, if you have an assessment that you love, please feel happy and encouraged to chat in the chat box. If you're the kind of person who finds that very distracting, you can just minimize the chat box or just don't look at it. But if you are sharing ideas or asking questions in the chat box, that would be fantastic, and it'll just make the whole thing more rich. Okay, so types of assessment. Two types of assessment I wanted to address are formal and informal assessment. So formal assessment we're going to define as sort of those structured, standardized tests, the kind of things that gave some of us stomach aches in K through 12. And I think, and that would include the Clas-and-Tabe, but it's not limited to the Clas-and-Tabe. An informal assessment tends to be more open-ended. It doesn't have to be paper to pencil. And as I mentioned here, it can involve teacher observation. Dale, is there anything you want to add about those two types of assessment?
No.
All right. Formative assessment. So if we're doing, if I'm doing instruction well, and this is always something I'm trying to get better at, then the idea is that the assessment should be driving my instruction, which I think is probably a phrase that we all have heard, like a buzzword, but it's hard. I find it really hard to do, so that there's a solid feedback loop between my checks for understanding and what my next step in my instruction is. So I'm doing these little observations. I'm asking students for the why. I'm looking over quizzes and assessments they've done. I'm looking at the questions that my students are consistently getting wrong in the classes or on the TABE. And it's informing, one, in a big picture sense, like, okay, next time I teach this lesson on dividing fractions, I'm going to do this differently because I can see a lot of students aren't getting it. But it can also be individual. Oh, he clearly understands the concept of division because the way he's doing that, draw 1,000 tick marks and circle it. So I need to work with him on some efficiency with the algorithm. He's got the algorithm, but he has no idea what he's doing, so we're going to break it down and do some things with manipulatives. So it's using that assessment to sort of feedback on my, my instruction.
Abby, I can add something now, and Rebecca just chatted that great informal assessment is, can you describe what you did? And exactly, it's like just asking the why is this a result, or why did you solve it this way, is very eye-opening, I think, for all of us. It's very simple to do.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So now let's talk a little more about how you differentiate content and then how your different students respond to that. So we'll hear from Abby first.
All right. Let's see. So for my setting, this is massive because it is, as I described, individualized, so everybody has a different set of objectives. Initially, I meet with each student and we talk about what their academic goal is. We talk about what their background is, to whatever degree we can get into it. And we also look at how much time we're going to have together because maybe unlike some community settings, I have a sense of how long until my students are going to be no longer my students. So I'll be referring them to a community program where they'll be leaving the facility. So we look at all of those things and try to make a realistic plan going forward, and then we'll revisit it as we go forward to kind of address what we're learning as we work together. Often my students will talk about the GED as their goal, and they often have very limited time, sometimes even just a few weeks. I use even for a student who is unlikely to be GED ready in the time that I have them, I find it useful as an initial sort of narrowing of what we're going to focus on to use the subtests as a way to help them focus, like, okay, which of the subtests do you want to focus on? And then I try to narrow that into what will be useful to them using other diagnostics and assessment. Let's see, for example, this isn't a math example, but if they chose social studies, I might start looking at the subcategories, and I'm going to be looking at what is really present on the test, but also what we're identifying, what they're helping me identify as gaps for them, and then figuring out narrow areas of study, like, okay, is basic geography an issue? What's their knowledge of the, the important U.S. historical documents? Do they have a general sense of an overview of U.S. history? Things like that. And I ask them to take an active role in helping me with that and identifying what they think they need. And I found for some of my students that I not only am asking them to do that, but sometimes I have to model what that might sound like. So, okay, so I need your help to help me figure out what's going to be most useful to you. That might sound like, Abby, I did this, I was doing this review set of practice problems, and every problem that had this little squiggly symbol, I have no idea what that means. Or it might sound like when I get into the problems that have lots of steps, for some reason when there's decimals in them, I can't get through them or whatever. So it kind of help them think about how they might go up to a teacher and ask for the differentiation. I mentioned earlier, I'm looking for students why they're getting the problems wrong, because sometimes that's speaking to me about differentiation in terms of the reason behind the errors. When I first came to a more individualized setting from a whole group setting, one of my concerns was about losing the whole group lesson. It felt to me like that was the most efficient way to teach. And I like the way that whole group instruction lends itself to collaborative work. But I also remember that when I had the whole group lesson, there would be times where there were one or two students who I knew I was losing, but I couldn't figure out a way to keep the lesson differentiated enough to include them and also keep everyone else moving forward. So I really like that about my current structure, that the differentiation is much more natural, that students can all benefit from instructions that's targeted to them, and when the lesson is, for whatever reason, not appropriate for them, they can be doing some sort of independent work. A little later, I'm going to talk about some of the forms that I use, and these aren't all mine. I've learned from a variety of teachers about forms to help me keep straight who's working on what and how far we've gotten, because if my cognitive load is sucked up with just trying to remember where everyone's at, I'm not doing as good of a job of instruction. But if I can have it on paper and I have a way to sort of check the form and a system for seeing where different students are at, then I can use my active thinking brain to actually be, I'm implementing the instruction. I also think that when we differentiate, there's a concern that students will get offended, like they'll feel like it's a judgment on how smart they are or what their capacity is. And for me, giving students choice has been really useful for a bunch of reasons, and that's one of them. So I say to my students, if I'm working on a mini lesson and you want to join in, great. And so if it wasn't a mini lesson I chose for them and they want to join in, they're welcome to do that. And that's been eye-opening for me in terms of who can access what material. I think there is a challenge there that students are limited in, or at least the students that I'm working with are limited in guiding their own instruction. And some students have previous experiential education which has led them to believe that moving through the material is more important than demonstrating mastery of the material, either because they're trying to save face or they don't have a lot of skills in sort of that metacognition self-assessment. So they feel like getting it done is the task. And so that is a challenge that I'm sort of developing my skills to work around in terms of helping students kind of metacognate and reflect. I bet those of you who have a stronger ACEs background than I probably have some suggestions in that area. But I think that is a challenge with any differentiation. So I guess, and then the second challenge I want to bring up is the one that I think I touched on it earlier, that students who have a fixed idea of learning and intelligence, that as if we all have a set capacity rather than we're all learning to gain more and more. Differentiation can, I think, feel really offensive to them, like a judgment on what they're going to be able to do rather than an assessment of where they are now. And so if they don't get the same work as the person next to, they believe that it has to be one of them who is identified as the stupid student. And so again, a lot of explicit explaining about what we're doing and why the work is different rather than maybe letting students slip into misunderstandings about why.
And so I'll give you a little bit to add to Abby's comments a little bit how, and this is Danielle, how to differentiate content. It might be as simple as having different level things to work on worksheets, even if that's what you're working. And I tend to keep some on hand if I know what some of the difficulties students might have, or even some might have different level worksheets or maybe extra books that I keep in the classroom, probably like most of you. And for example, if we're working on word problems that have to do with computation, and a student is not able to read the problem because their English level is too low, they're not able to do the computation yet. They don't know how to add or subtract yet. They're not ready for the word problems. Then they might just be working on computation. And the main group, the students who are on level in the class, will be working on mixed word problems, meaning they read a problem, they have to decide if they're supposed to add or subtract. And a student who is even above that level, because either their English level is higher or their skill level is higher, might be working on something that has mixed in terms and 2 steps in the word problems. Or they can be, or even better, if you have some kind of application problem that they do. So if you have those, and those are not too hard to come by, and they could be used readily, and you can have them on hand. As far as students being upset or wondering why everyone isn't doing the same thing, I haven't seen any problems in the about 3 or 4 years I've been teaching math. I think students simply appreciate working at their own level and on something that's not too easy and that's not too challenging. So before we move on, I would also like to mention in the chat box, Sally shared an assessment that she likes to use, and it's called Basic Essentials Mastery Tests. Basic Essentials Mastery Tests, that's something that you'd be interested in doing.
And I think, Sally, I wonder if it's the same book we're talking about. So Steck Von has a very old school workbook called Basic Essentials of Mathematics, and I don't think it's sufficient enough for the whole program. It's really just computational practice, but I like the mastery test. They have a book 1 and a book 2 and the math test in the back. It's like 5 problems of addition, 5 problems of subtraction, 5 problems of multiplication. It gives a very clear sense of your students' computational skills, and it's I think it's not very intimidating for a lot of students, especially if you start with the one from book 1. Oh, well, so this is one of the forms that I'm using for tracking my thoughts about students. So I have a binder that has these this form and a couple of other forms in it, and I think that in the resources you'll get a copy of this form, although of course it's just an example, you can vary it. There's actually a book called The Together Teacher that inspired this particular form. So I have a group of these, and they're dated for each of the days that I'll see my students in upcoming days, and I just date them as far as I need them. And then I have 2 groups that I see, so you'll see on the left it says AM, on the right it says PM. And for the future days, I make notes of things students need. So a student might come up to me and say, I was looking at this practice, and this stuff about ratios is really confusing to me. So I may make a note about a particular mini lesson a student needs, and I'll write it for the morning or the afternoon for whatever day I'm planning to do it. And then as I move around to other students during the day, I may notice other students I can group with that student. So I'll make a note like, hey, Rodney and I are going to do a lesson on some work around ratios tomorrow. I think it would be great if you want to join in. I'll make a note of other students who may want to participate. Or if there's someone who needs a particular TABE test or another kind of assessment, I'll jot those notes down there too. And you can see at the bottom, I needed a place. When I just had 2 columns, I found I was writing notes in here that did not belong in there. So the bottom has spaces for other things I have to do, like, oh, I've run out of copies of this, or I need more books like that, and then ideas that are more long-term ideas.
Excellent. That's really helpful, Abby, to see that just practical way that you keep track of all of those different needs and content areas that you're juggling. Let's talk now about process and how the two of you differentiate process in your classrooms, and again, how your students have responded to these different methods. And this time, let's start with Danielle.
Hi, again. One way that you can differentiate process is to have students work in groups or in stations if you prefer. When I teach an ELL level math class, I'm more likely to assign students to their groups. But if I teach a higher level or an ABE math class, I will usually let students choose their own groups. Either way, like I mentioned before, students are pretty happy to be working at their level. Here's an example of students who are working on the same task. So they're looking at the same content. So you've got this map up on the screen now. So it's the same content, but they'll be doing tasks at different levels, so different processes. This shows a map that I made of the neighborhood around our school. And I'm in Minneapolis ABE at South Campus, so that's where it says school. And I thought it would be really nice if I could start with something concrete that students are familiar with. So what I did is I either by group, well, I'll explain that in a second. So the lowest level or the low level group is asked to identify any lines that they see and say whether they are perpendicular to each other or whether they're parallel to each other. I also asked them to look for some angles. So that would be the below level group or the beginning level, we could say. And at a higher, slightly higher level than that, the students are also asked to identify what type of angles they see. As you can see on the second map, I've drawn in a few of some of the things that as examples of what the students have identified. Then I'm asking them to identify if the angles they see, are they acute, are they obtuse, are they right angles, are they complementary, are they supplementary. And as you can see, 32nd Street, the line is missing, but one person said, well, these four right angles form a rectangle 360 degrees. At the highest level, I'm going to ask them to extrapolate some information. And we have Hiawatha Avenue, which is the one that's diagonal between Lake Street and 31st Street. And I asked the students who might be able to do this, I said, how could I find the distance, on Hiawatha Avenue between Lake Street and 31st Street? And that's all I asked them. So they said, well, if we know the distance on 22nd Avenue, as you can see here just to the left of our school, the distance between Lake Street and 31st Street, and then we can make a right triangle, and then we can also, if we can know the distance where it says B on the map, if I add another line there, then we can actually create a right triangle, and we can use the hypotenuse, and that's using the Pythagorean theorem. So when I did this activity with my students, they were able to do that. And since I did not group them separately to do this. The students worked with partners. I asked them to do I think, pair share or a turn and talk, depending on the lingo that you use. And I asked specific students, because I had a good idea of what level they might be able to do, I asked someone who might be below level or like a beginning level, as we might say, to come up to the board and say, okay, show us some angles that you found. So they were able to do that. And then I would ask a student who I knew maybe, or from circulating and listening to the students, who would be able to answer, what type of angles do you see? What type of lines do you see? And so on. And for the third, and someone being able to explain what the length of C is, which is the hypotenuse. So when we did this, I thought the students felt they participated well, and it was differentiating in a sense, but nobody knew that if somebody else didn't know how to do something or not, and they weren't, they all participated fully. And I was able to do that because I knew the students' skills and asked them, that a person who might be able to answer only the first question or two to come up to the board first. And I actually did do it with volunteers, and it's not a problem. And So just to finish on discussing process I just want to say that you don't have to have necessarily 3 groups. You could be students working on level and then students working above level. So it's not, we're talking, the examples I've given, and I said below or on or above level, but it does not necessarily have to be 3 groups. It could be 2 if you prefer.
Excellent example, Daniel. Thank you. Abby, would you like to add anything about how you differentiate process?
Sure, and if you don't mind, I'd be curious, would folks mind in the chat, when you hear like differentiation or you think about how to differentiate, does your mind first go to content, process, so like differentiating the content of what you're teaching, the process of how you teach it, or differentiate the product the students have to produce? I'm just curious what people's first thing they think about when they are thinking about differentiation. So again, when you differentiate, you're thinking about content. So like the material you're teaching, the knowledge or skill you're teaching. Are you thinking about product, the like task, the outcome of the task, or are you thinking about process? Okay, yeah, so lots of product and process I'm seeing. Yeah, so I felt the same way. So I thought actually this question was really interesting for me to sort of reflect on, differentiating process, because it's, when I think of differentiation, it isn't the first thing that comes to mind for me. So I was like, okay, well, but I do different things with different students. So I was like, okay, how do I do that? For me, I think part of it is trial and error with different students, or luck and finding something that works for them. Again, that sort of informal observation of what really engages a student. I'm sure we're all doing that to some degree. Also, to some degree, it's decided by what's available in the setting. There are times where in my setting, I do have a similar peer that a student could work with, and sometimes I don't have a similar peer who's a good fit. So that is going to determine, it's going to change the process by which I might teach the same lesson. Let's see. Sorry, I hear someone on the someone's breath on the mic. I don't know if somebody wants to. Okay, so I might have a bunch of students doing similar work, and I might have one student work through something with me and teach me or teach a tutor how to do the task. So they take on a teacher role, and we ask them questions to get them to think through the process. I have another student who is really easily frustrated and needs tons of processing time, and really preferred to work alone to a degree where any kind of pairing did not work. And I found that even sometimes my working one-on-one was too anxiety-producing for him. So I would write him notes and leave them for him, and he would sometimes even take them and bring them back. And over time, he would write me back, and then I would write him some notes back. And we slowly moved into being able to have like a talking conversation about his work, but he needed that level of kind of change in the way that I normally would have approached working with a student. Some of my students really love game format, so anytime I can turn it into something where there's cards or competition involved. And other ones like to feel like they're like getting jobs done, so the way that I might structure the way that we're working through the same work would be different. I'm also looking not only at their sort of interests, but what else I want to help them, what else I want to nurture. So a lot of my students have already had lessons on mean, median, mode, and it's something that I'm trying to, because it is all over the GED, I'm trying to hit with it with as many students as I can, and it's especially even just like going over those words and what they mean and the basics of how to find them is something that many of my students now can do. So I have a student who has where the confidence is an issue that's getting in the way of his studying. It can be really powerful to have him be the one to do some of the instruction for a new student who's learning mean, median, and mode. It kind of gives me a clone in that I know the student knows the content I want him to teach. I can be with a different student, and it gives that student a boost in terms of like, look, you know this and you know this so well that you're gonna lead it, and of course the review of getting the chance to teach it. In terms of student response, in terms of differentiation of process, again, because of the way that my setting is set up for individualized instruction, I think a lot of students don't even notice that that's happening. Occasionally, some students are defensive because they have an eye for fairness. So how come he's not getting the same? How come I got something different than they got? And again, I'm just really open to, well, if you want to join in, you've done this content, if you want to join in and do the other activity, go for it. And then, of course, the other piece of differentiation is sometimes students will ask for more support, which, of course, is the easiest time to then add in a differentiation of process.
Thank you, Abby. So one way we can think about differentiating process is to provide a variety of instructional support. So we've summarized some of those possible supports here. They might take the form of some sort of vocabulary support around math vocabulary, academic language. That might look like a word wall, small group lessons focused on particular vocabulary, dictations. It might include a review of key foundational concepts, so helping students move through the levels of knowing mathematics, providing needed formulas, or drawing on students' prior knowledge, or scaffolding, providing structured support at various points in the lesson. So that might be vocabulary cue cards, graphic organizers, or using sentence stems to provide additional support. Danielle and Abby, do you want to elaborate on any of these examples? And I would also encourage our participants, if you use any of these supports in your classrooms, if you want to share how you've used them in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, I'll share a couple of examples. If you teach, if you're an ELL teacher, the word wall and the dictation will be quite familiar to you. And what I like to do with the math classes is I might do a quote dictation where I say, okay, write the sum of 3 and 5. So, and then the students write 3 plus 5. And I will do that. I try to do something like that about once a week, and we actually use the whiteboards, the erasable whiteboards. And so the students can write their answer and then write their answer and show it to me, hold it up so I can see, so I can scan the room very quickly to see if they understand it. And also for those who are doing the GED test, that's good practice to use those whiteboards. Another example, maybe if I'm reviewing vocabulary, and for another geometry example is I say, what is a right angle? And a student can write down 90 degrees, or they might be able to draw a picture of a right angle. So here we accommodating different learning styles and preferences also. And I found that if I do that about once every week to 2 weeks, they like doing that. Excuse me.
Abby, did you want to add anything here or respond to Sally's question about games in the correctional setting? Abby, you are muted, so why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm just going to sit here and talk to myself.
Talk to yourself. I'd love to be in on that conversation, so please share.
I'm sorry. I don't know if anyone has questions about anything on the list or things that they would add to the list of instructional supports. Sally, I started to chat you back about games in the correctional setting. I think so when I look here, from what I've heard, I think there's a little bit of variation in terms of what different correctional settings will allow teachers to have. If you're narrowed down to just paper and pencil, or if you're allowed to have index cards, I find that a lot of games can be modified. So often I see simple math games that involve playing cards or involve dice, and if you can't have those, if you put, you take a little piece of paper and you write the numbers 1 through 6 on them, stick them in an envelope or even balled up on the table, and students randomly draw one. It gives the random number generation that a dice would give you. I had a game that I wanted to play that I found online that had it used playing cards, but I just took slips of paper and wrote the numbers 1 through 10 on the slips of paper, and the papers, you can use different colored papers if you need different suits, and that's worked really well. There's so many games that teachers are using in their classrooms. If you just, if you're Googling math games with slight modification, I find I can make them fit, make them fit what I'm doing, what I need or what I'm limited to in my classroom. And if you are interested afterwards to email me, if you're looking for specific games, I can certainly send you descriptions and the printout materials of games I play for fractions, multiplication, subtraction, things like that.
Okay, so we've talked about content and process. Now let's talk about product. How do you differentiate product and what you're asking students to do? Danielle?
Yes, first I'm going to share an example, and you'll see it on the slide, is an example that was shared by Rachel Johnson, and she was going to join us today, but she was unable to do so. And this is something she has done with her low-level ELL learners, and in my low-level ELL classes I've done something very similar. And what the students did is they kept track of how many if they ate fruits and vegetables every day. In the example, it shows 4 days. They kept track for a week. And so how many people actually ate fruits and vegetables that day? So this is something she did, I would imagine, in relationship to the health unit or the food unit in her class. And so on the 4th day, so on Thursday, students, they had kept track, they kept tallies on the board, and together they made a graph. You can see this bar graph. And so the teacher makes the bar graph on the board, and the students help the teacher make the bar graph by choosing how many places to mark and so on. And then the students will copy this bar graph into their own notebook on their own paper. I would suggest using graph paper to do this, because they can more easily mark the spaces. But if you need it a little bit more challenging, or if you're also teaching the students measurement at the same time, you could hand out rulers and have them mark each line spacing 1 inch or 1 centimeter or something like this. If you've ever done something like this in your class, you know that it can be quite challenging for the students to keep it accurate and to keep their lines even and those kinds of things. I would suggest, if you can, the first time you do something like this, to have a volunteer helping you to circulate around the room. So the lowest level students would simply copy the bar graph onto their paper. And again, if it's the first time a student does this, it's quite challenging. And then all students do this first activity. And then the teacher you can circulate as the teacher, and you can see if someone does this quite readily, and then you can have them change it into a line graph, which is in the middle of the screen here. And they, of course, would not have seen this for the first time. They would have done it previously with other information, so they would know the difference between a bar graph and a line graph. And you could also have students change the bar graph sideways, so just change from vertical bars to horizontal bars, and that's something I've done in my class for differentiation. And finally, for the student who is at the highest level, who could do this very readily, could collect other information on an additional topic, and maybe they have that information already collected in the notebook, and they could make a graph about that. So that is the example that Rachel Johnson provided for us, and I will add just a little bit of information. Is that sometimes the product, I might, if it's a kind of project that we're doing, for example, if we're doing some measurement unit, and I might have students measure the floor, for example, of the classroom on graph paper, and they can measure that floor, and they can write the length of it, the width of it, and they can use rulers and everything, or yardsticks or measuring tape and so on to do that. If a student is able to do that very quickly or very readily, then I'll say, okay, now you're going to buy new tile for our floor. How much would that cost for tile? And either I could give them a price for tile or have them suggest one, or if there's plenty of time and I have access to the internet, I can have them look them up, the price of tile at Home Depot or something like this. And a third level, increasing from that, and if the students, they already know, they figured out the area of the room, they already know how much the carpet's going to cost. I say, okay, now you're going to have that carpet delivered to your house, so how much is it going to be for delivery, and add the percent for sales tax. So using one activity, and I can just have, if I have a few of these ideas in my mind, I can just say to the student as they finish. On a test, classroom test that I make, I may add just a little bit of differentiation where I can add a challenge question at the end that's a bonus question, and students like doing that because it doesn't take any points off if they miss it. Or I can make the classroom test more difficult or easier. For example, a student might take one test with whole numbers, and another student, I might just change the numbers to decimals or possibly to fractions. And I can have a couple different versions of that test, so those would be also two different products.
All right,
Abby, would you like to speak to how you differentiate product?
Sure. I just have a little bit. I think at the most simple level, it's accepting approximations. So, meaning that my students are going to have varied levels of skills. So I'm not expecting their answers, their solutions to be the same levels of accuracy or thoroughness. It may mean also that I have to push some of the students to be more robust in their answer. So while I'm going to accept for one student that he's set up the problem correctly and he's got the right answer, another student I may be asking them to go into more depth in their explaining of their answer. And I think, in general, this one to me is very related to the two above, because I think sometimes differentiating the content or the process is what dictates how the product is going to look different, whether it's a paper and pencil task or it's a tutor conversation or they're using manipulatives or whatever it is.
So at this point, we want to talk briefly about how the standards for mathematical practice that are part of the College and Career Readiness Standards for Adult Education can help support differentiation. So these are the standards that describe what we hope that all mathematically proficient students at all levels will be able to do to approach math effectively in their daily lives and in the classroom. Abby, would you like to talk a little bit more about how you think these practices can work with differentiation?
Yes. So I think, yes, I would. I think that the math, so I think of the CCRS as a tool for us as teachers. And I'm looking at it and saying, how can I use this to make my job easier? So a bunch of people got in a room, right, and wrote down a bunch of things they know about good math instruction, and I'm going through it saying, how can this help me? And for the standards mathematical practice, when I'm looking at it in terms of differentiation, I think I can go through the standards and think about that these are ways to frame differentiation. So if I'm looking at students doing the same lesson, but I'm looking about how it makes sense to differentiate it for them, there's a lot of things here that I think could be different. So I talked a little bit earlier about different product, and I think, where I'm going to ask some students to have more robust answers, and I think that 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. So I may see an opportunity where one student just getting through the steps right now is enough for him, or just, but another student may have that down, and I may be wanting to give them tasks around the same math problem that's going to get them practicing some of the skills to construct arguments or critique reasoning. So I can use some of these. I think model with mathematics is another one I mentioned earlier. So I might have students solving, and for some of the students it may be appropriate for me to have them talk about this computational problem, the problem they're doing, and how would they use it as a model for a real-life experience. So I can use these to try to think through what the differentiation might look like. That's what I got. Danielle?
Thank you. Danielle? Danielle, you are muted, so please make sure to unmute yourself.
I think if we had more time, or we could also explore how these are related to ACEs, and they are, and in terms of the student being in charge of what they're learning, and they're navigating systems and so on. So I just maybe at at a later time we can make that connection, or in our follow-up materials.
Okay, so for folks who are on the webinar today, what advice do you two have for getting started?
I would
Danielle?
say, yes, sorry. I would say just keep it simple like anything else as you get started. Maybe find or think of something you can do without having to prepare a lot of materials or copy a lot of things, and maybe start with a class that you've taught several times before, and you may anticipate some of the needs that the students might have. That's what I would say.
I'd
Abby,
be
what would
curious
your
if
advice
people want
be?
to in the chat. So I'd be curious if people want to in the chat what they're seeing as a barrier to doing more differentiation. So feel free, please, to go ahead and do that now if you have a thought about what is intimidating about it. To me, it's time. For me, it's having enough time. I see so many needs, but having enough time. And so what's been helpful to me is to say, okay, I'm going to give myself permission. I'm going to be going at this work for a long time. I'm going to pick one small area, or sometimes if I see a ton of need, I'll say, okay, where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck? Where's my differentiation going to either be useful, I'm going to be able to reuse it many times, or it's going to hit the most student, or maybe the student with the deepest need. And I'm going to pick that one piece. So I'm making a second version of something, or I'm making a tool where students asked with the same word problem, but the students asked to give their argument for why a certain piece of it isn't incorrect or something. So I'm just building it a little bit at a time and then reusing those tools or fine-tuning those tools when I get to them. And for me, what's been helpful with that is I know packets get a bad rap, and I understand that there is limited value in just having students work through packets or workbooks, so we have to do more than that. But I think for me it's been helpful to pull together packets as a way to prep for the differentiation that I'm going to do. The packet isn't the end product, but pulling together a packet of material that is ready to go for how I'm going to differentiate my solving for solving for sort of a single variable lessons is really helpful, especially because my students are moving at each at their own speed, and sometimes it's not as predictable as I would like when they're going to get to the next thing they need. So having that stuff ready to go in a way that I can have sort of thought through, building that packet sometimes helps me think through how I'm going to lead different students through that series of mini lessons. So that's been useful. And then we saw one of the grids. I have another grid that I use that actually the teachers at my site have developed and are using to sort of keep track of different pieces of work that students are working on, different lessons and activities. And that, again, is also really helpful for sort of taking some of the load off me and putting it onto that organizer so that we can focus on the instructional work.
Great advice from you both. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we move on, or do participants have any burning questions before we moved on to a couple of guided practice situations?
I'll say first, it's a good idea to, if you do differentiation and you don't do it every day, but maybe when you have a volunteer in your classroom. I have a volunteer once a week, so I try to remember to do, if I'm going to do different groupings, to do it on that day.
Good suggestion.
I mentioned that I use paper packets. We are relatively tech limited compared to some community sites, but Amy Vickers and I just watched a webinar on global math department about project-based learning, and one of the things that the teachers who were leading that webinar talked about that I thought was really cool, they called it a playlist. So it was like it was an electronic version of the packets that I'm trying to create on paper. So they had a series of links, and their students, there were some like must-dos, if you will, that all of the students were supposed to do. So, and then there were some things that were may-do, so students could sort of guide, or the teacher could suggest certain things. So it was all on the same content, but there were different things that were maybe more of an extension or dealt with building up different areas of the students' understanding of the concept, and some that were some that were straight computation and practice, and some that were more involved. So I thought that was an interesting way. One of the teachers on my team is a special education teacher, and she's constantly reminding us that black and white text is one of the worst ways to convey info that you want students to retain. So I thought that high-tech playlist was such a fascinating way to do it, and so they had hyperlinks on there to videos and games, but also some of the more low-tech tools were stored there as well.
Excellent, thank you. So now let's look at a couple of different guided practice lessons and get your input on how you might differentiate some of these lessons. So here is our first example. Abby or Danielle, would you like to walk through the example?
Esther, can you click forward one? I think there might be some
yes,
things on
we thought. Okay, so we have two examples, and we thought we would keep them as simple as possible so they can apply to as many teachers as possible. And so this first example is if you have a lesson that is, as it says on the screen, you are teaching them today how to multiply a 2-digit number by a 1-digit number. So what we would like for you to do as participants is, if you have some ideas about how you might differentiate this lesson to either a higher level student or a lower level student, please put them in that chat box.
And if anyone would like to talk through their ideas, please raise your hand using the hand icon at the top left of your control panel, and I can unmute you and we can hear your ideas.
So if you're feeling stuck on answering this, maybe a sub-question that you could answer is challenges that you've seen. So sort of how do different students have different problems with this objective?
Encourage people to think back on some of the suggestions that Abby and Danielle shared around differentiating content, process, and product.
Andy's sharing an idea in the chat box about showing an area problem, and that's something that would be applicable to folks. And also show the 2-digit number, for example, if it's 37, as two separated numbers that you have. If it's 37 times 2, for example, you have, it's the same as 30 times 2 plus 7 times 2, which introduces the concept of distribution, which is helpful at all levels, and it's used extensively in algebra. I can share an example where some folks are still thinking also is if I have a student who does not exactly know what multiplication is, maybe, or they don't have a concept, maybe they know how to go through the steps, and I may show how, or have them show me how multiplication is actually repeated addition. So if it's 37 times 2, to go with Andy's example, is I might have them show me how it's 37 plus 37, or I may work with smaller numbers and use some manipulatives and use it that way. And if a student is above level on something like this, maybe create some word problems. Maybe I would have those same same numbers that other students in computation with, of 2-digit by 1, and have students that could actually even create some word problems around that if I carefully chose my numbers before I presented the material to them. And Darlene is suggesting that we may ask the students, which is a great idea, for situations where you might need to do this. When would you use multiplication? That's a great share. And I know there's some other ideas being shared here that I may have missed. Let's see here. Oh, the global math department that Abby's sharing. And there's free PD around math, so that's, and also we can share that with you at the end.
For those of us who, I like, who was it that just talked about, yeah, I like Darlene's example. I think for those of us who were part of the Minnesota Numeracy Initiative training about levels of knowing. That can be another way, I think, to think through how I'm going to differentiate instruction in terms of what levels of knowing are the students already, is this particular student proficient at, and where do I need to build them up. And then Rebecca had mentioned something about helping a student see this as repetitive addition, so understanding what the constant multiplication is, or revisiting that when you get to multiple digit multiplication, and that also, of course, is building up their flexible thinking too.
Okay, let's look at another example.
In this example, we are asking our students, or our objective for the day is to demonstrate a conceptual understanding of equivalent fractions. So we'll give you again a few minutes to share some more ideas of how you might differentiate this lesson.
Andy, go ahead. I've unmuted you.
Hi. Yeah, the pie chart and I think using money that just came up on the chat boxes are awesome. I found a program called SkillsWise. It's out of the BBC. So unfortunately, well, not a big deal, but a lot of their stuff is in, pounds and pence and stuff like that instead of dollars. But they have a really nice visual of ways you can visualize fractions, and they'll show like 2 pizzas or show 2 pitchers of water, and you can put in different values and see how the 2 pitchers of water are at the same height filled up when you have these 2 different fractions, and they'll show the divisions on them. My students have really liked that, to get a visual on it.
Andy, could you put a link to that resource in the chat box?
Sure.
Great, thank you. What other ideas do people have? Again, thinking about content, process, product, how you might adjust the different levels of knowing.
I think several people have made suggestions, and as we know, the more we can connect directly to what students already know. Money is always, I think, the best, or time, or temperatures, yes, and so on. For this one, can you guys hear me okay before okay.
Yes, you sound great.
If a student doesn't have a conceptual understanding of equivalent fractions, I may use, like this, some people said, manipulatives with the money, or I might have like a pie chart and have them tell me how if I have my pie and it's cut into 8 pieces, and say, okay, show me half of it, and then we can say how that's the same as 4/8. And those of us who've been through M&I know that if we're talking about fractions and equivalent fractions, that it's best to work with and start with what we call the benchmark fractions, which would be teach our students half, and then teach a quarter, and then teach 3/4, and then teach 1/10. And because with those they can go a really long way. If a student is able to do equivalent fractions very well, I may have them do some word problems, and when they get to their answer, if it's easy for them, I say, okay, now change your fraction to a decimal, or change your fractions to percents, and it's just practicing additional skills, and it doesn't take any prep.
Any other ideas that folks would like to share? Abby, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'm seeing some great ideas in the chat box. I think a lot of the things Danielle mentioned can also be flipped around to be kind of assessment points that I can use as for diagnostic. So checking to see, does the student have the vocabulary around it, because that's going to help me figure out what to differentiate, or does the student have a set of benchmarks that they work with when they think about fractions? Are they pretty comfortable with 1/2 and 1/4? Some of the other ones. If I can assess whether the student knows those, that's going to help me figure out where to jump in. And that is, I think, even if you're teaching a whole group class where the program does a really good job of pre-assessing and leveling your students, you're going to have that range of need in your classroom. And so figuring out those, assessing that level of detail, I think, is really helpful in figuring out, one, how to differentiate, but two, how you can help your students use each other as resources so they can learn for each other, which goes back to the practices and letting them sort of build some of the communicative skills around math too. And I think that's probably good not only for ESL students but also for our native speakers for whom math feels like a foreign language.
Also, Rebecca was sharing how she has students actually fold their own fraction bars so that they can see that if they have a bar, they fold it in half, and then they fold it in half again, that's actually a quarter of what they had originally. So anytime we can use manipulatives is great, as we know, and it's hands-on, and they'll remember it better. And also, Darlene just mentioned that fraction bars help with rulers, understanding rulers. Yes, absolutely, helps us definitely teach the measurement.
A lot of excellent ideas shared there. At this point, I want to wrap things up. Our presenters can stick around, and if you've got questions or other ideas that you'd like to share, we'll stay on for a little bit. But I want to thank you all for attending and participating. Thank you to Danielle and to Abby for giving us so many concrete, excellent ideas for differentiation. And thank you to Amy Vickers, who's been listening in via phone, who also worked to develop this webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email after the webinar that will have a link to a variety of resources, including the PowerPoint. So I encourage you to take the time to follow that link and download those resources. You will also be able to find a recording of the webinar and associated resources on the Atlas website in the math section. So thank you to everybody for attending today. If you do have any further questions for our presenters, they'll stick around for the next few minutes. So feel free to either chat those or raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask those. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.